Hello and welcome to the next one of these. We take a look now at this. Against the military dictatorships in South America. Military dictatorships came to power throughout South America in the 1970s and 1980s. They tortured and disappeared thousands. People were thrown out of helicopters. People were dragged out of their beds in the middle of the night. These dictatorships were deeply conservative and right-wing and ran the economy in partnership with big business. The term fascist would not here be a slur, but rather a reasonable description of what they were. Millions were thrown into poverty by the policies of these governments. But local elites became richer, and American corporations profited handsomely. Amnesty International and other groups fiercely criticised the human rights abuses of these governments, and the tortures and killings were routinely criticised in the West. These governments had a reputation for being terrible human rights abusers. However, what we didn't tend to hear about was the political program and the ideology behind what they were doing. To speak the truth about this would have landed Amnesty et al. In trouble with the media and some of the establishment institutions which fund human rights groups. Amnesty staff wanted to tell the world the context of the human rights abuses, but Amnesty was not in a position to do so. By simply telling the truth about what was going on, they would have made themselves look like lefties. Their political neutrality would have been compromised. Amnesty would have lost backing from its sponsors, and so on. So we in the West got the impression that the killings and the torture were just senseless, and that the governments were simply power-hungry and abusive, almost for no reason. But actually, there was a considerable degree of ideology behind what they were doing. What was this ideology? Free market economics, and an extreme interpretation of this. Who put them up to it? The United States, that is, the elite and establishment in that country, specifically the government and the CIA, and in no small part the right-wing economist Milton Friedman. Economists and students from countries throughout South America were invited in large numbers to study at the notoriously right-wing Chicago University Economics Department, to study under Milton Friedman and his colleagues. At the same time, army officers from the same countries were invited to train at the School of the Americas, where they were trained by Americans to kill and torture dissidents. The CIA helped orchestrate the military takeovers which followed. The recipe was to seize the state in a violent coup and proceed to radically restructure the economy by destroying trade unions, ending food subsidies for the poor, privatising virtually everything, slashing investments in health and education, and all of the same kinds of policies which were imposed on African countries and others by the IMF and the World Bank's structural adjustment programs. Millions were thrown into poverty overnight. Naomi Klein has written about this phase of history and has called it planned misery. These governments knew exactly what effects would follow, and they went ahead and did it anyway. There were huge protests because that is the entirely natural response to a government overthrowing your elected representatives, closing down schools and hospitals and trade unions, presiding over huge falls in people's wages and huge rises in the cost of food and other essentials. The protests were met with extreme violence and torture. In Chile, a huge football stadium was turned into a concentration camp for ordinary members of the public, who had protested against being thrown into poverty. Sometimes individuals who had not even been protesting were dragged out of their beds in the middle of the night and tortured or killed just to demonstrate who's boss and to instill fear. The only way a government can implement such extreme free market reforms is down the barrel of a gun and with the aid of the torture chamber. Chile's General Pinochet said to his very good friend Margaret Thatcher that she should follow his policies back in the UK, talking about these extreme free market reforms, which she had a watered down version of this. And she said she would love to, but we have the kind of democratic institutions and checks and balances that would make it difficult back here. But she was pushing ahead with privatisation nonetheless, and the attacks on the unions and so on that happened under the Thatcher government. What Chile and others were implementing was an extreme form of Thatcherism and neoliberalism, and led to huge increases in inequality. This is what Thatcher would have liked to do back in the UK, but thankfully we do have those democratic institutions and checks and balances which prevent this to the degree that was going on in Chile. In Chile, great social progress, this is before General Pinochet came to power, before he seized power. Great social progress was being made. Working class people, i.e. the majority of the population, were seeing wages rise thanks to effective trade unions and a friendly government. Thanks to socialist policies on education, more and more families were seeing their kids get a decent education and heading off to university for the first time. Development was very much from the bottom up, i.e. ordinary people were earning a decent living and driving economic growth from the bottom up. The atmosphere of hope and progress was crushed when Pinochet's tanks rolled through the streets and reversed all of the gains working people had made during the Salvador Allende era. All of this was instigated by the USA. What was their problem, the American government and CIA and business leaders, with this social progress in their backyard? It was the threat of a good example, people democratically pursuing development. The US elite saw the role of its backyard, South America, as being to provide cheap resources and labour. These countries were there to be exploited. They could not be allowed to develop and prosper or to declare any kind of autonomy and independence from exploitative US hegemony. The Third World was there to be exploited by the First World, and this could not be allowed to be challenged. Latin American countries were founded on massive inequality. Feudal landowners had everyone else working for them for a pittance. Thus, a tiny elite, descended from the Spanish conquistadors, exploited everyone else. Well, as the USA became the world's dominant force, US businesses started to muscle in on the action, and they felt that their position of dominance could not go challenged. Any redistribution of wealth or resources, or really any pro-development policies which enabled ordinary people to start improving their standard of living, all these had to go, even if it meant throwing the masses back into abject poverty and torturing or killing thousands. None of these governments were communist, but the US was swift to disingenuously label them as such, as a slur, as a propaganda tool to whip up sentiment amongst the American people in order to get support, popular support back home for demonising these South American governments. Then, when the military takeovers happened, of course, it had nothing to do with them in the US government, although it was nonetheless celebrated in the American media as progress. And they said things like a gleam of hope in the media, when it was in fact the opposite. Well, it was a gleam of hope for American businesses and for the rich local elites. For the majority of the population in South America, it was a return to despair and fear. These regimes lasted up to about 20 years, and then gradually some semblance of democracy returned. In the 21st century, socialist governments are once again being elected. It seems that America is overstretched with Iraq and Afghanistan and South America, and is now strong enough, and South America is now strong enough to fend off US subversion and sabotage. In a poor country, it is an entirely natural thing for the people to set up and vote in a left-wing government. It is as natural as the workers of a factory wanting to set up a trade union. The return to power of the left in Latin America is a sign of hope, and will hopefully usher in a new era of bottom-up, people-led development and a new age of prosperity for the developing world.